House of Wolf, Part 1. Emily Bront would have approved of the carriage, or maybe Jane Austen, Amalie thought, as the vehicle in question bumped and rattled over the cobblestone driveway. She surveyed the three other occupants, an American couple from Kansas and her Auntie Grace, as they grit their teeth and held on to the antique wooden seats of the lurching carriage, pain borne resolutely. "How'd you hear about this tour?" the Kansas woman asked. Her voice was breathy and her accent had the southern twang. Amalie snapped out of her reverie as she realized the sweaty, sunburnt blonde was addressing her. "I'm a relative. This is a family reunion." Amalie spoke loudly, trying to be heard over the noisy wheels. The woman's eyebrows rose and she glanced at her husband, who was staring stoically ahead and avoiding eye contact. Sweat poured down his full cheeks from under his baseball cap. "I thought the Fuchs family was German," the woman asked. Her wide eyes flickered over Amalie's copper-colored curls and tanned skin. "Austria, actually. The original Fuchs, my many-greats-grandfather Lucien Fuchs, came to Antigua in the early 1800s to establish his plantation." Amalie began, but the woman interrupted. "Yes, but you say you're one of them?" she persisted. Amalie grinned. "Ah, they knew about the family curse." "I mean, how's that possible?" the woman persisted. Amalie was about to explain that she was a cousin to the current Fuchs who was running the estate, but then paused as the true meaning behind the woman's seemingly innocent question registered. She smiled brightly. "Oh, you mean how is a black girl a relative of a white family?" Her voice rose so sharply the man side-glanced her before continuing to stare ahead. Auntie Grace muttered something under her breath and put a restraining hand on Amalie's forearm. Amalie snatched her arm away. "You see, back in the good old slave days, my ancestor used to rape his slaves. Little girls, teenage girls, and grown women. So I got my hazel eyes and copper hair from his side, and my nice bronze complexion from my raped ancestors. So yes, I'm a Fuchs by blood, believe it or not." Auntie Grace made a kissing noise with her teeth and muttered something about embarrassing children. Amalie's attention was riveted to the Kansas woman's mortified face. The woman turned to look out the carriage window with her lips pursed tightly. 10 minutes later, the 18th century covered carriage clattered to a merciful stop, and the driver hopped down from his seat and opened the carriage door. The American couple quickly took the lead to exit the carriage, awkward in their effort to move their bulk through the narrow door and down the little step ladder. Amalie helped Auntie Grace to exit. Auntie Grace gripped Amalie's hand as she went down the steps, her knees and hips racked with arthritis. "Welcome to Fuchs Estate," the driver, a lean and agile man in his 20s, declared enthusiastically. Amalie surveyed the restored great house and the carefully kept grounds. Acres and acres of green stalks waved in the distance beyond the manicured gardens. Despite the sweltering heat, the views are pleasant and lush. The house itself, although only 2 stories, was sprawling and charming in white and pastel greens, with large windows and a wraparound veranda. It looked and felt like old money. "Grace! Grace!" a voice called out, and a trim and energetic woman with a neatly trimmed gray bob and dressed in a navy blue ensemble of slacks and a sleeveless tunic-style blouse walked out the front door and down the wide stone steps to greet them. "Charlene! My goodness, girl, you always look so young! How are you doing?" Grace exclaimed as Charlene enveloped her in a big hug. Charlene turned her big gray eyes on Amalie, and it was her turn to exclaim. "That is little Amalie? No way! Come give your grand some love." She said this all in a rush and then grabbed Amalie in a tight hug. Amalie grinned, her previous irritation forgotten. Charlene held her and then whispered, "Thank you for coming. We need you." So, Amalie thought, it's true. She wondered if she was up to the task her grandmother had given her. The American couple was standing a few feet away and looking at Charlene and Amalie with keen interest. Charlene released Amalie and extended her hands to them. "Welcome, welcome! I'm so glad you made it. "We have your rooms ready, and Antoine will take your bags up," she said warmly. "Please, follow me. We have lunch service now, and you can eat on the terrace overlooking the rose garden. It's just beautiful." Charlene indicated that everyone should follow her, and so they entered the house after her. A cool breeze wafted across the large rooms, which were furnished with wicker furniture. Colorful and elegant throw rugs covered the aged cedar floors. The white walls brought a crisp freshness to the rooms and were complemented by the spring green trim. Amalie paused in front of a hallway filled with a series of old painted portraits, yellowed with age and antique frames covered in dust. The dust and grime seemed at odds with the meticulous layout of the rooms and the smells of lemon pledge and fresh air. Charlene ushered the others into the dining room and came to stand quietly with Amalie. "They always looked like this? The same?" Amalie said after a few minutes of reflection. Charlene smiled and gave her a quizzical look. "I know I was a child the last time I visited, but I don't remember these paintings. The men all look, I don't know, angry? Fierce. Check out those beetle eyebrows," Amalie laughed. Charlene chuckled. "Yes, there are some family traits which get passed on. Some good and some, well, you know. Gran, I'm here because you asked, but you should know I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in the Fuchs family curse," Amalie said firmly. Charlene's cheerful expression became serious, and Amalie was distressed to see the sheen of tears in her eyes. Impulsively, Amalie grabbed her hand. "I used to be like you, Amalie, but I've lived here. I hear the ghost. I've seen things. There's blood on this land, and it's calling for revenge." Charlene's voice trembled. "Blood? Revenge for what? You never mentioned this in your letter," Amalie frowned. Charlene squeezed her hands. "I'll explain everything, but not now. I have to make sure the guests are settled in. It's not been easy opening the house to strangers, but it pays the bills." The twinkle came back to her eyes, and she turned, pulling Amalie along with her. Amalie had her own thoughts on the kind of people who would want to visit an old slave plantation for the fun of it, but she kept her opinions to herself. Fortunately, that moral dilemma wasn't left to her branch of the family. As they entered the dining room, Amalie gaped at the impressive spread laid out for them. She spied sauce, dukkana, fungi, and pepper pot. The American couple were oohing and eyeing over the selection as Auntie Grace explained the various dishes. "Conch!" Amalie exclaimed, delighted Charlene had remembered her childhood favorite. They sat and ate of the bounty and praised the cook, Mrs. Roberts, who had been with the family for 30 years. Auntie Grace flexed her swollen fingers and groaned. "This heat is giving me a flare-up. Amalie, come and massage my hands for me. I have some bay rum, that usually helps. Everybody, excuse us, please." She stood up slowly, and Amalie followed suit. Their room was on the first floor with views overlooking the gardens. Amalie stood at the window and marveled at the array and variety of beautiful flowers that seemed to be growing in profusion. The delicate, sweet floral aroma filled the air. "You don't remember this place at all, Lily?" Auntie Grace asked as they sat on the queen-size bed together. Amalie massaged Grace's swollen joints. The strong bay rum smell was overpowering the floral scent of the gardens. "Well, after Mom and Dad divorced, Mom said she wasn't keen on me coming here by myself to visit. I guess as she was an ex-in-law, she felt awkward about bringing me, and Daddy didn't seem to care if we visited his family or not. I haven't seen much of him since the divorce. A call on my birthday, gifts by FedEx for Christmas, that kind of thing," Amalie remarked absently as she focused on her task. Grace stooped. "Charlene spoiled that boy too much. And look now, he never even calls her or check on her. He left Antigua like Jumbi chasing him. No sense of duty for his family. Imagine someone Charlene's age has to run this big place by herself," she grumbled. Amalie glanced at her. "What about Uncle Eric or Wolfgang?" Her great-aunt shrugged. "Eric not well, and Wolfgang help out when he feel like it. He gets some big job in Barbados and he's leaving. Amalie framed her next question with caution. "She never asked you to help?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. But she felt Grace stiffen. "Our father left the estate to Charlene, so I suppose she sees it as her responsibility," Grace responded. Her tone was sharp. Amalie felt irritation well up. "I don't understand this nonsense with Caribbean patriarchy," she ranted. Grace rolled her eyes. "A little university education and all of a sudden you know everything." Grace tried to move her stout frame higher onto the four-poster bed. "How is it fair? Because your mother was a maid and Auntie Char's was a wife, that makes you unworthy to inherit? You're sisters! And she should have offered to split the property or at least invite you to run it with her." Amalie's face flushed. "Keep your voice down," Grace snapped. She stared at Amalie, but the young woman held her gaze. "Amalie, what you're talking about, that's all history. You need to think about your future," Grace said. Amalie heard something meaningful in her great-aunt's tone. A dark suspicion began to waken in her mind. "Gran asked me to come because she needed my investigative skill as a researcher. Why you sound like it's more than that?" she demanded. Grace's gray eyebrows flew up. "Investigate what? I don't know nothing about that," she retorted. Amalie stared at her silently for a few minutes. Unlike her grandmother, Auntie Grace had made it her task to stay in touch with Amalie's mother. She had even visited them in New Jersey several times in the last 10 years. "What do you mean, the future?" Amalie asked, her eyes narrowed. Grace plucked at the Anglais cotton comforter and muttered something under her breath again. "That's for Charlene to tell you. But you need to start thinking of your responsibility as a Fuchs." Grace turned away from her and closed her eyes. Amalie stared at the stout elderly woman and wondered if she should shake her until the truth fell out. She got up and went to look over the grounds again. She glimpsed a gazebo next to a water fountain that was not turned on. "I don't remember a gazebo being there," she mused aloud. Grace thought she was speaking to her. "It used to be boarded up after a girl got attacked there many years ago. Your grandfather had plywood nailed around it to stop people from using it. Then Wolfgang convinced Shaw to open it up again for the tourists." Grace's tone indicated she thought this an ill-thought-out decision. "I'll go for a walk and check it out," Amalie said. She turned and was slightly startled to see Grace was sitting bolt upright. Her eyes were wide. "Don't go near that place, you hear me, child?" Grace ordered. Amalie's eyebrows rose. At 26 years of age, she was hardly a child, but she was more intrigued than annoyed at Grace's response. "Auntie, you okay?" Grace took a few deep breaths and steadied herself. "Bad luck at that place. People see things there. Some people even got hurt. Please don't go there by yourself," Grace said in a calmer manner. "How do people get hurt in a gazebo? Wait, you said someone was attacked? What happened?" Amalie came and sat down on the bed next to her. Auntie Grace pursed her lips in disapproval. "I don't know what happened, but people say bad things happen at the gazebo. Please, just stay away from there." Grace looked at her with watery brown eyes. Amalie knew she was a few years older than Charlene, but Charlene seemed eternally youthful, while Grace diminished in vitality. Amalie grunted but made no such promise. The rest of the day, Amalie spent revisiting her childhood haunts on the ground. Naturally, she visited the gazebo, but there was not much to see beyond peeling paint and an overgrowth of vines. The evenings in the Caribbean were heralded by dramatic, beautiful sunsets, followed by the sudden onset of night. Charlene, as part of her plantation experience for her guest, insisted on a family-style sit-down dinner, formal dress. Amalie dressed in her white Grecian toga-style gown and emerald-dropped earrings and gold sandals. She examined herself in the vanity mirror and conceded she looked attractive. She wasn't unaware that she was pretty, but she had found it a nuisance when trying to be taken seriously. She met Auntie Grace in the hallway, and together they walked past the sconces where candles flickered. "We eating by kerosene lamplight too? Shaw taking this authentic thing too far," Grace grumbled. However, as they entered the dining room, they both stopped and gaped. Charlene had staged the dining room table with silver candelabras, a rich ivory tablecloth and linens, silver service, and freshly cut roses in crystal vases. Charlene was seated at one end of the table and looked resplendent in a black strapless gown and tasteful diamonds. The American couple were seated as well, and seemed slightly awed by their setting. At the other end of the table, Wolfgang rose to greet them. Amalie wasn't sure what she was gaping at more. Her cousin had grown up to be tall and very handsome with chiseled features. He kissed her cheek, and then gave Auntie Grace a hug. But she noticed his smile did not reach his gray eyes. Dinner was sumptuous, and Amalie ate with gusto. At one point, as she was enjoying delicious passion-fruit ice cream and trifle, she glanced up to see Wolfgang was regarding her over the top of his wineglass. Their eyes locked, and she had the odd impression that he was upset. She turned to look at her grandmother, who was laughing a little too loudly. Auntie Grace sat with a strange, tight expression. Eventually, Charlene fell quiet, and the conversation died. Amalie put down her spoon. The American couple exchanged a troubled look, and then excused themselves to go for a walk in the gardens. Charlene smiled serenely, and Amalie wondered if she was so tipsy she couldn't sense the incredible tension. "It's tradition," Charlene suddenly announced, startling them. "It's tradition," Charlene repeated, and directed her intense gaze to Wolfgang, who glowered back. "Fuchs always goes to the next female. It's the tradition," Auntie Grace said. She nodded to Charlene. "But didn't your father run the estate in his days? And surely his father before him?" Amalie asked, confused. Charlene shook her head. "Yes, but that's because their sisters didn't survive infancy. Fuchs always goes to the next female heir," she said. Her eyes glazed over as she stared at her son. "That's you, Amalie," Auntie Grace said. Sorry, I mean, what?" Amalie sputtered. Wolfgang gave a bark of laughter and stood up. He sneered at Amalie. "Good luck with the family curse, cousin. It's all yours now." He stalked out of the room.